My name is Garrard Conley. I began conversion therapy at 19 after being outed to my parents. It nearly cost me my life. This is everything I'm authorized to tell you. I think a lot of people just think, oh, it's that dramatic practice that happened like in the last century. It happened in this century to me, and it's still going on. We were terrified. If you stood the wrong way, if you put your hand on your hip a certain way, that could be reported to the therapist, who would then take you in their office and shame you for a very long period of time. Conversion therapy is any attempt to change the sexual orientation or gender of any person by use of coercion or force. I arrived at Love in Action in June of 2004. My mother drove me up and she said, well, this place looks really tacky, for the amount of money we're spending. Because I think at the time, the 2-week session that I was in, which was like a youth group, was about $2,500. So we pull up, we're not impressed. It's in a strip mall. It's got ugly decor on the walls. My mom left right after she dropped me off. She wanted to see the place, but they said that she couldn't, that it was private and restricted. There was not a strip search per se, but definitely a patting down. One of the people there looked through every one of my belongings. He would pull out cards from my wallet and say, okay, well, where did you get this from? When did you go here? Is this a phone number that if I called it would be inappropriate? I had a notebook and I was writing short stories at the time. But when I entered Love in Action, they looked through my notebook and they decided that it was what was called a false image. It was misleading me in some way. And they ripped those pages out of my notebook and threw it away without reading the story, really. They were disturbed that I'd written a female character, and they said that I was identifying with the female character too strongly. Everything was kind of streamlined. I had like a 274-page handbook with rules and regulations that were laid out. There were so many rules, like how we were supposed to talk to one another, how we were supposed to report behavior, how we were supposed to think in any situation. If you have a temptation, turn to page 55 and you'll see this sort of rundown of what you're supposed to do. It also had testimonies by people who had been cured, and it seemed like they were following a script, right? So it'd start with I did all these horrible things when I was younger. I wasted so much of my life. Here are the consequences. Here's why I'm so, so happy today. I mean, these people didn't seem happy at all. They seemed really, really deeply unhappy. They got into great detail on what we should wear. So men should not wear sleeveless shirts or anything that's going to be suggestive of their muscles or their bodies. Women were told to wear bras, and we were sort of taught that a surveillance system was important for this whole endeavor. We had to check each other for, if you're a man, feminine behavior, and if you're a woman, too much masculinity. So basically they were saying that if you're a straight man, you act a certain way, and if you're a straight woman, you must act completely effeminate and submissive. They had bizarre rules too. I mean, there were suggestions about how if you are going to slip up and masturbate, here's what you should do. You should switch over to thinking about a woman at the very end. So there was practical advice along with theoretical discussions about masculinity and femininity. Outside of the handbook, when you first entered Love in Action, there was a map of the city with zones and places that were marked that were safe, and everything else was evil. We were prohibited from eating in certain restaurants, from going anywhere secular. So what that meant was if a bookshop or a store was not explicitly Christian, that during this time I should not enter it. Although my mom did sneak one night, we went to the Peabody Hotel in Memphis, which is a really nice hotel, and ate this beautiful Italian dinner. And I remember feeling very guilty, oh no, I'm going to be influenced by this secular culture. I was constantly being told how to stand, how to act, what my posture should be. Those were things that I couldn't help, right? The way that I stood comfortably, the way that I spoke. It was not something I could just suddenly erase. Every day was rigidly scheduled. That schedule would consist of silent Bible study in the morning, group therapy. Then we would split off into our groups and do activities that were designed to teach us that we were wrong. Then there would usually be testimonials, anything from ex-drug addicts to people who'd come out of homosexuality. And then we would go to a separate church and do another lesson. We were never really allowed to be in a group together without a conversion therapist nearby because they didn't trust what we were going to tell each other. Love in Action had a rather unique approach to conversion therapy in that they were sort of structured like what I would now say is a kind of demonic Bible camp. It's like you go to vacation Bible school and you do crafts and you like read about the Bible and sing and do those things. Well, there was no singing, there was no music allowed other than Mozart and Bach. We were allowed arts and crafts, but they were designed to like make you feel shame about your life. We went to church at various points, but there was no singing or eating together. It was like a lecture. I wasn't prepared for being placed in a group therapy session, and especially not with the people that I was there with. There were people dealing with bestiality, pedophilia, marriage issues, but we were all grouped together in one session in the mornings. And the assumption that Love in Action was using was that all sins are equally sinful within God's eyes. Many of the people there had tried to commit suicide. I remember thinking, wow, this is really serious. Like I could die if I don't change, or I could become one of these people that I don't expect to become. But what I wasn't expecting was seeing these people whose lives were in many ways broken and being treated the same. I'm 19 at this point, and I'm being told like people's lives have been completely ruined by their sinfulness. I was sitting next to older men who were like, yeah, I lost my lover to AIDS. That was never true love. It was just a fantasy, and now I regret everything I ever did. Or a man who would say, I lived 12 years with another man, but it was always selfish and greedy, and we were just using each other. There was still a part of me, I think, when I showed up at Love in Action that thought, well, maybe I can still have a future with a man. But suddenly it seemed like every future that I was meeting was a tragic one. They were saying all the time that everyone is equal in their sinfulness and that God loves us all anyway. They would say that sometimes. But then what you really learned that they felt was that we were particularly disgusting. So they had a 12-step system that was very similar to Alcoholics Anonymous, with the first step being, you have to admit to God that you're wrong and that the part of you that believes you're gay is wrong. And as hokey as some of their teachings were, and as silly as it sometimes looked, or the ugly Bible verses crocheted on the wall, any judgments I had could easily be shut down with, well, when an alcoholic goes to AA meetings, it's not glamorous. The best way I would describe moral inventory would be testimonial format, really, is what it was. It was, I grew up in the church watching testimonials, so the assumption was, you've done bad things, it's time to talk about it, it's time to confess, and then tell us why all that stuff was wrong. So we did this like every day. That was our homework. Everyone had a really gruesome moral inventory, and mine were like, I went to the underwear section and looked at pictures of men in underwear. And so I started making things up, I think by the third day, like, oh yeah, I kissed a boy, only wishing that I'd done that, at some point. They would interpret my lack of experience with stubbornness. They would say, you're not revealing everything. You're not telling me what you really did. I think I made up like masturbating with somebody I never had, but I just made it up to like please them. So in a way, I knew that there was something deceitful in doing that, but I was also really afraid of what would happen if they kept telling me that I wasn't really committing. And I was terrified of them going back and reporting to my parents that nothing was working and that I was stubborn. Fear was everything during that time. I mean, like, that was my entire motivation for getting out of bed, for continuing to do it, even though it felt like my life was empty. The instructor would kind of pile on anyone during the therapy sessions that was revealing anything personal. We could never talk positively about anything gay or, gender related that they didn't like. I talked a little bit about video games when I was there and how much I loved them. And they told me that that was the way the devil entered our minds often. And other people, had sort of perked up and said, yeah, I like that video game too, or blah, blah, blah. I mean, it could be something as simple as Mario. And they're like, yeah, it's evil, it's talking about mushrooms. Like they just come up with some reason why it was bad. After someone gave a speech, you'd have to say, I love you, and then say their name. You'd get up and you'd share the darkest secrets you could, and then everyone would shame you and mock you. And right after that, it'd be followed up with, I love you. And I think it taught us a very dark version of love. They had an activity called the genogram, and the goal was to teach us why we were in conversion therapy, to say that the sins of your fathers are bearing down upon you now, and that's why you have an H next to your name for homosexuality. What it did was it really flattened my family members. It made me look at them as if that's all they were. I didn't really like looking at my family members like they were just sinful people. Love in Action was a conversion therapy facility in Memphis, Tennessee. It was founded around the year 1973, which was the same year that the American Psychological Association declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. It began as a church group in a small church in San Rafael, California. It quickly escalated from there. A few years later, Exodus International was founded, and that was one of the largest international conversion therapy organizations in the country. That began a movement where slowly people started to medicalize the problem. What they decided to do was to bring in a lot of different practices that could help systematize really the path out of homosexuality. So Love in Action had many programs. The one I went to was called The Source. It was a 2-week trial program for younger people. Really what it was designed to do was to get you to buy into a longer program. The Source was like, okay, congratulations, you passed 2 weeks. Now it's time to go to 3 months. Then you got to commit to a year, then 2 years, and then you're a permanent part of the staff.
Who are the people that are actually running this program? What qualifications did they say or claim to have? Yeah. Like, how did they get that position?
Well, John Smid started off in a support group in a church for people dealing with homosexuality. So he himself was gay, and then Love in Action asked him to be the leader, so he did. He was, I think, married twice to women, and he had used these practices to create some semblance of a quote-unquote normal life. Those were most of our counselors. There was a sense of holier than thou. I was really angry at the time that someone who obviously couldn't hide who they were was lecturing me, because I felt like I was good at playing the part. Nobody knew really about my sexuality until I was outed. And so I thought, wow, y'all are really bad at this. I was constantly scrutinized by the staff members, being told like, oh, you're reading too much, or I can see you thinking. That was something that I heard a lot. I think it was very hard for all of us to settle in, because on one hand, it felt like a very familiar world that we were in and comforting. Like I grew up around youth pastors my whole life. They acted like youth pastors, so it felt like I could relax at times. And then on the other hand, you know, we were being shamed constantly by these people that we were told to look up to. And I think that was really hard for everyone, including myself. We had this one session where we had to do masks. We had these plastic masks that we had to decorate. On the front of it, we showed really what the world saw us as. I was the good son. I sort of pasted together this, like, you know, these Bible-y things and crosses and things. And then on the back, we were supposed to show the ugliness inside, sort of what we were hiding from people. And I looked around at the art supplies and I said, well, you don't have anything that can really do it for me, because, you know, I would need like some tar. They were like, that's not funny. You need to take this seriously, and you need to really commit to this exercise, and you're distracting other people with your humor. I was definitely one of the main targets because I was skeptical of a lot of things and I would ask questions. And so anytime I would sort of react with a question or be academic in any way or like push back on anything, even a small thing, it was seen as evil. I can recall a moment when I pushed back. We were in a session on family dynamics, and we were being told all the stuff, the Freudian stuff about how this is what your father needed to act like, and if he didn't, then he probably turned you gay. One time someone said, well, you know, really what you probably want, and you don't know it, is that you want to sleep with your mother. And I'm sitting there just like, did I just hear that? Is this what we're saying in this Christian setting? And so I said, well, I took a Western literature class and we talked about Freud, and I don't think that's right. They were like, how dare you question that? You know, we know this, blah, blah, blah. And so I was shamed for that, even though I could tell with a few of the expressions around the room that they agreed with me. You know, I've done some research since being in conversion therapy and discovered a lot of brainwashing techniques that are used around the globe. They happen to be very similar. They happen to involve a lot of rules. They happen to involve a lot of surveillance. They happen to involve a lot of repeated phrases like, no, that is not what you think. Here's what you actually think. So the correction was the point in many ways.
Looking back, what do you think kind of motivated staff members?
I think these people were truly religious people, for sure. I think that they believed that they were doing the right thing. Like, it's really hard to wrap your mind around the idea that these people thought they were doing good, but they did. That doesn't mean that cruelty didn't come through. There were people who were very cruel there, who would mock gay behavior or whatever they deemed as gay. But I think they did that out of self-disgust. I think they were disgusted with themselves and what they really wanted to express in their lives, and so they pushed it out, you know, on us. And I feel great sympathy for those people. You know, like, they were trapped in it much longer than I was. I remember meeting John years later after conversion therapy, after he'd renounced it and said that he didn't believe in it anymore, and he apologized. And he was still evasive about what he'd done. And I even had compassion for that, because I thought, I don't think I could live with it. So I grew up in a really small town in Arkansas called Milligan Ridge. And the only real community that we had, aside from my dad's business, was a Baptist church where we would hang out pretty much all week. One day, when I was in Sunday school, I think I was about 12 or 13, a man came into the classroom with a petition that was against a pride parade that was taking place in a town not far from ours. And he said, I want everyone in this room to sign it. And I remember thinking, as the paper went around, that if I signed it, I would be a liar on some level, which was a sin, because I was attracted to other boys my age. But if I didn't sign it, everyone would know that I was gay. And I signed it. And I remember in that moment thinking, okay, well, I've got to hide who I am somehow. During that 2003, 2004 period, there was a lot of anti-gay rhetoric. We had the marriage amendment, which was being voted on to forbid same-sex partners from marrying. And it was not that distant from other stories like Matthew Shepard. So I learned how to mask a lot of what I was actually feeling during that time. And I had a girlfriend, and we met in church, and so she was kind of my shield during that time. My father is a really interesting person. That's why it makes it really hard to be angry with him. He worked at a cotton gin and owned it for 25 years, and that made him a major figure in our town. You know, everybody knew him, everybody loved him. And so when he became a minister, he went all the way. The entire community was watching me for signs of like, are you like your dad? Are you going to be a preacher? All these things that I had almost no interest in doing were expectations that I felt were on me. So for me, there were just two sides of me. One was evil and wanted to rebel and to live my own life. And the other was the good son and the straight son and the son who would follow in his father's footsteps. And I think that they were very separate people, and I was a very private person for that reason. Everything was going smoothly until my freshman year of college. It was a liberal arts college, and in that setting, there were these new ideas that were really forbidden when I was younger. You know, I grew up hearing that abortion was evil, that women's rights were nothing but a hoax, and that the LGBTQ movement was just basically perversion. So suddenly I'm in an environment where people don't believe that. I was shocked. I started questioning everything that people were telling me. And I think that without that one semester, I wouldn't have been equipped to leave a place like Love in Action. You know, literature and critical thinking, those were the things that saved my life. I had a roommate who was a friend from high school, and he was very religious. My roommate told me that he had assaulted a 14-year-old boy in his church group, and I remember at the time thinking, oh my God, I've never encountered this in my life. And also thinking like, is this what happens when you're gay? You know? And one of the reasons I thought that was because of so much language at the time, and it still exists today, around the idea that gay people are predators and that they will assault people younger than them if they get into a position of power. I reacted very negatively to that disclosure from my roommate, and he assaulted me that night when I was asleep. The next day, I told some friends of mine because I didn't know who to tell, and they told their mother, who then called him and yelled at him and told him he was a horrible person. I went to the minister at my school. It was a liberal arts school, but it was Presbyterian. And the minister basically told me that without any proof, I had nothing and that I should be quiet. My roommate found out about it, that I'd told. He called my parents because he knew them. And he said, Garrett is living an openly homosexual life at school, which was not true. And he said that they needed to come pick me up and do something about it. And I remember thinking, if I leave college, you know, like, what else do I have? Because this is the world that is teaching me to think and is teaching me to feel less shameful about myself. So my mom shows up at the school with a friend because she's afraid. And we sit on a bench outside. She said, is this true? And I lied and I said, no, it's not true. My roommate did something horrible and he's trying to cover it up by using this. And my mom said, well, I think we need to go home anyway and talk to your dad. I was in the back seat crying the whole time, thinking like, how do I get out of this? When my dad learned that I was gay, he took me into his bedroom, closed the door, and said, listen, I've spoken with Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis. They tell me there's this great program that has a high success rate. You're going to do great, but you have to do it. And that if I didn't go there, that I wouldn't see my family or my community or talk to God ever again. I denied it the whole night, but he didn't believe me. And finally he said, I need you to swear to God that you don't feel these things. And I couldn't do that. And that's when he knew. After that, I went to my room and looked up a quick search on like, how do you have credit if you don't have any credit? It's like, how do I live on my own? How do I become independent? And it was all so overwhelming that I just gave up. My parents sent off for an application for Love in Action in Memphis. I should have known from the start, what I was up against, because the application, not only did it have absurd questions in it, like, have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, or have you ever done yoga, which they saw as Eastern and evil, but they also had questions that were deeply personal, like, what fantasies have you had? They wanted you to be vouched for by a preacher who believed that you were willing to change. We called on the preacher in our local church who wrote a letter of recommendation for my application. And I would say that my application was harder than my college applications. After that came the brochures and the planning, and that's when I went to about 3 months of one-on-one therapy with a conversion therapist who was connected with Love in Action, and that's where he basically had me divulge all my sexual thoughts and shamed me. And he would ask me to go into great detail. And after that, he would say, well, here's a few Bible verses you should memorize, and here's why this is disgusting and shameful. And he would always express disgust, not only in his words, but in the way he looked at me. I just felt a lot of shame, and I didn't want to talk about it with my mom or my dad. They would ask questions like, what did he say? And I wouldn't talk at all about it. I think it was the start of depression. I didn't have a lot of motivation. And I think that my mom understood this on some deep level. I'll never forget one of the sessions when I was in this one-on-one therapy. She saw how sad I was. She saw that depression. And I had been in a slightly better mood before then. I came out just completely drained. And she said, let's go shopping. Of course, in my brain, I'm like, oh no, I can't go shopping with my mom. That's gay. Your brain just starts thinking all of these things that are totally normal that you would do with your family are somehow evil. She buys me this like really expensive, beautiful coat and has me try it on. And, I look good in it and I'm feeling good about myself. Almost instantly, I was like, you're disgusting. Like, look at you, you're gonna cover it up with this coat that makes you look even gayer. And like, I always felt, as long as I could keep my secret, that I had some kind of power over my life. When that was not a secret anymore, there was really nothing to hang on to. And this new person that I was becoming, who was bitter, angry, cold, distant, was not somebody I liked. And it was something that I saw reflected in the conversion therapists I met. There was just something fake about all of it to me. But then again, I thought, well, maybe that's what you have to do as an adult. Maybe you just have to be fake. It was crazy because my dad was being ordained as a Baptist minister the weekend between my 2 weeks of therapy. I think that my dad really believed in these people who sold him this idea that like, okay, once he hears for sure that this is wrong and he hears it enough time, then he'll change. And I think he literally thought that I would just show up at the ordination ceremony totally a different person. And that's not what happened. What happened is I showed up and I was like a zombie, and my mom and me were asked to stand up on a stage with my dad as he was being ordained. Someone says, during the ceremony itself, do you commit to ensuring that no one within your congregation will ever believe that homosexuality is a good option? And he said yes. And I remember, I was like destroyed by that. When I returned, we had a big exercise called the lie chair, which was something that's often used in real therapy. So you sit across from an empty chair and imagine a person sitting there and say everything that you wish you could say to them. In conversion therapy, their assumption was that I hated my father. And they told me to sit in front of a chair and share all these intimate feelings I had about my relationship with my father. And they did this in front of everyone. When I said to them, like, I'm not actually angry at my dad. I love my dad and I feel sad right now. They said, that's not what you really feel. You have to let your anger out. And I said, well, I don't have any. That would be a lie, which would be a sin. Several people got up and started yelling all these insults like, you know, you're not really here for the right reasons. You're a plant. You're like fake. All these things just to try to get me to engage in the activity. And that was the moment that I walked out of conversion therapy. It was an auditorium. And I said, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to. Everything that I believed about Christianity was based in compassion. And suddenly I was being told that I needed to hate my father in order to be healed. I got up from the chair, started to walk out of the auditorium. They tried to stop me. I went to the office where all my belongings were, including my cell phone. And I said, I need my belongings. And the guy there said, no, not unless it's an emergency. And I said, well, it is. And he gave it to me, gave me my phone. So I went to the bathroom and called my mom. And she was staying in the hotel room not far away. And she didn't ask any questions. She just said, okay, I'm going to come get you. She drove off. I'm in the car, and she pulls over on the shoulder of the highway and says, like, I've heard all these stories about people. Are you going to end your life? And I said, yes. I can't even place myself back in that moment because I knew that if I said yes, it was the real test of my mom's love for me. Because if she says we're going back after she hears that, then there's nothing left. She said, I'm never taking you back there again. I was surprised, honestly. Like I knew my mom loved me, but I just thought the pressure of all of this would get to her again. We drove back in silence, came to the house, didn't tell Love in Action what we were doing. And my dad answered the door and he said, well, did it work? And my mom said, what do you think? You know, we're back 2 days early. Like, no, it was never going to work. And our family closed the door on that conversation for like 7 years, maybe. We didn't talk about it. It was like a source of great shame for all of us. I know my mom talked to my dad a lot during this time, but, you know, he was struggling too with just what he'd done and what he saw in me when I showed up on that doorstep. Like, I was not the same person. After leaving conversion therapy, I mean, luckily I chose, I think, good choices. But I went to Ukraine for 3 years in the Peace Corps because I was just like confused about what my life was and I needed some other culture to understand my own culture. That pain doesn't just go away. It like stays there. And you have to deal with it every day of your life. I can just shut down or be cold or like just stop speaking to people for months because I don't feel safe with them. And it's not anything they did most of the time. It's like something triggered it. I can't walk into a real therapist's office. It just like creates intense fear and anxiety. Going to church, impossible. Like I won't do it. And it's not because I'm not a person of faith. It's not because I don't believe in some version of God or wouldn't find community there. It's because of what happened. That's what makes me the angriest about many of these therapies, is that they close the door on so many things that could heal you. My mom was supportive from the minute I left conversion therapy, so she was sort of the easy one. Of course, it took her a while to get around to being comfortable with any boyfriends I dated or anything like that. But she said to me a couple of years after conversion therapy, she said, I used to pray every night that you would change And then one night I got the great idea to ask God if I should change instead. And she said she woke up the next day feeling totally different about it. And so I believe her. When I had real conversations with my dad years after leaving conversion therapy, I discovered that he was just trying to fit into this idea of what a Baptist minister should be. He still believes the way he does. He's still a missionary Baptist preacher. And he and I disagree on a lot of things, but we share a lot of things too. Like, I give him poetry every birthday. When I went back to his church, I totally expected, like, years later for people to be really rude to me. And instead they were really kind. And I actually met this lesbian couple that was in my dad's church. And I said, do you know what's going on here? Like, are you sure you're supposed to be here? And they said, yeah, but your dad's actually really nice to us. And he doesn't ever judge us. And he never tells us to change. And I thought, well, that's a change. So he may have his own personal beliefs, but he doesn't push it on other people now. I think in his heart, he's completely changed his mind on everything. And he can't say it out loud in his church. He would lose his job. And I think that that's a kind of closet too. It's one that people don't really talk about a lot. The book that I wrote about conversion therapy, like, I did not want to write it. For years, I did not consider myself to be an activist because I didn't like what that term seemed to suggest. And I didn't want my entire life to be conversion therapy or the conversion therapy survivor story. After a while, I was just like, oh yeah, I do know a lot about conversion therapy. I have a singular message that I'm not hearing anywhere else, and the nuance to provide, hopefully, a way towards legislating against this practice. And I have the ability to go up in front of people in churches, speak in the language that they speak, and tell them why this is wrong. When I wrote Boy Erased, there were 0 states that had banned conversion therapy. Almost half the states have now banned conversion therapy. And that was in large part thanks to the organizations I worked with, like the Trevor Project, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, Born Perfect, all those organizations that worked with me and with the film version of Boy Erased to really raise awareness around this issue. I continued writing after conversion therapy. I wrote a historical fiction novel that was published last year called All the World Beside, which was about many of the same themes, but set in New England with Puritans, and there's a gay love affair, so, and the family sort of reacting to that. Currently, I teach at a state school in Georgia called Kennesaw State University. I'm a tenured professor there in creative writing, and I also run workshops at Bennington's MFA program. Love in Action, they were a nonprofit, so there were plenty of politicians and organizations that were funding conversion therapy at the time. Focus on the Family was one of the big ones. They had a big Christian network, and they funded a lot of it. So Love in Action and Exodus International sort of popularized conversion therapy, but it existed well before they became organizations. St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. back in the 50s and 60s was dealing with patients who went there who were either disclosed as homosexual, or they were found out, or they were caught. Many of the patients there were subjected to various shock treatments. Some were subjected to lobotomies. Forced hormone therapy or chemical castration was also used. So this was a very dark practice for the queer community back in those years. And I think most conversion therapy places, I believe, aren't necessarily doing physical alterations to people or electroshock therapy, but it's transformed over the years to be more talk-based.
How familiar are you with the 2005 state investigation into Love in Action?
Love in Action was investigated around the time that this kid named Zach had posted on his MySpace at the time the rules that Love in Action had sent his family. His name was Zach Stark, and he was in a documentary called This Is What Love in Action Looks Like. He was kind of like the first big moment where conversion therapy became a CNN headline. And there was a big protest happening because people found that blog post and they were terrified by what they saw, right? They saw that this was very coercive, a very dangerous place for this sweet kid named Zach, who was like 16 years old at the time. So it was like the story came and went, everyone's done, they're never going to apologize. So when I saw John Smid apologize online, I was shocked. I believe Love in Action ended in 2012. Exodus International quickly followed the year later. I mean, to say I was shocked is quite an understatement, because I never thought that they would ever admit that what they did was very harmful. I wrote a short blog piece about my experience in conversion therapy around that time, and he came in on the comments, and I was so terrified to read his comments because I thought he's going to deny everything. And he said, "Everything you said here is valid, Garrard. Like, I did wrong. I'm so sorry for harming you." And then Alan Chambers, who ran Exodus International, apologized the year later, and I started contacting many of these therapists because I wanted my book to be good. Then spoke with a bunch of survivors, and that was really, I wouldn't say healing, but I would say it rounded out the picture for me. I could see that these people were really sorry for what they'd done. And that's why I included John Smid in so much of the promotion around the movie and the podcasts that I did, because I thought people do need to hear his story. I may not personally like being in the same room with him. There was a lot of stuff around how these former leaders capitalized off their stories that made me feel icky. It made me feel like I was part of that I was one of those. But I decided to include their stories anyway, because I thought there's no way you can know the story without knowing what they were thinking at that time. Now, during the very anti-trans moment that we find ourselves in, conversion therapy is being used primarily against trans people. I think that there is an easier way to get people to send their kid there by using anti-trans rhetoric or gender ideology fear. And that's where the movement is really picking up steam right now. Conversion therapy can only be regulated up to a certain point because it's often surrounded by the issue of religious liberty and freedom of expression. So the only battle that we've really fought through legislature is to make sure that licensed individuals do not use conversion therapy on minors. The UK has been trying to ban conversion therapy for quite a while, but I don't think that's passed fully. You know, even within the States, there's a lot of complexity. A lot of people say, what's the point of these victories? Because, in fact, they feel largely symbolic. They don't stop the majority of places from practicing conversion therapy. They don't stop churches from doing it. And what I say to that is that my mom, when she looked this up in 2004, she found websites that were saying conversion therapy is good for your child. And now, in 2025, when she looks that up, there are warnings. And I'm very, very proud of some of the legislation that we've passed to end conversion therapy for minors in many states. When you're a parent, it's often very scary to see your kid not fitting into boxes, you know? So what I would say to a parent who is thinking about conversion therapy is let your kid grow. Let them find out for themselves who they are, because this coercion that you're putting them through is only going to confuse them more. We grow, we change throughout life, but the brainwashing techniques that are often used in conversion therapy have effects that last forever.
What is something you might say to people who are put in a situation, whether it be by a family member or a close friend or something where it's an ultimatum, change or you lose this part of your life?
What I would love to say to them is oh well, screw it, walk away from that kind of thinking because it's dangerous. But I won't say that to people because they're in a position of great vulnerability. What I think you have to do in those moments is remember what you really feel and what you really are deep down. That's hard to do. I've spoken with so many people who went to conversion therapy who went along with the game because it was, they would have ended up without housing, on the streets, in an unfamiliar place, if they hadn't gone along with it. It's not easy to find a new community that's helpful rather than harmful. It's not easy to get your faith back when it's been used as a weapon against you. Yeah, I'd say just hold on and hold on to the truth. Keep that other part of yourself alive, the part that is planning for the future.
Hi, I'm a producer on Authorized account. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment with more topics that you'd like us to cover in this series.